Welcome everyone to ClayShareCon Day 5. I think this is the last session we have for the morning session for Day 5. I'm just double checking. No, we got one more. And then we'll have a break and have our afternoon session. But right now we have Stencil Raku with Michael Harbridge from LearnFiredArts.com. And I think you're going to really love this. He did a raku for us yesterday using horsehair and feathers. So this is kind of a sister broadcast to that one. So let's send it all over to Michael and see how he's doing. Hey, Michael, how's it going?
Good, great. How are you guys doing?
We're doing great. We're so glad you're here with us for the raku.
Yeah, thrilled to be here again. Good to be the last day.
Yes, sad, but yeah, it has to happen, unfortunately.
Yeah. So I've got, we're going to be working in an electric kiln here. And the first thing that I'm going to do, we're going to kind of do this backwards. I'm going to take the pieces out of the kiln. And while those cool, we're going to go back in my studio and I'll show you guys how I got the pieces to this point, and I'll answer questions and talk about everything involved with the raku. So I've got my daughter Cameron here. She's actually going to open the kiln for me so I can pull the pieces out. And they're going to go into a metal trash can. I'm going to pop those outside so I'll go out of view with the camera for just a few seconds as I take that out. My kiln room is set up here. It's under the deck of our house. And so I've got sides here that all open up. So two sides of this open, and I'm going to pop this side open so that the smoke goes out. And so Cameron can get out of here once she's done with her part. And I'm just going to tip the camera down here so you guys will be able to see the trash can and the flaming, and I'll talk about that as we're doing it. I'm going to pop this door open here. Cameron's going to grab, so I've got a metal cable up here that is a pulley on the kiln, and she's going to pull that cable. I'm going to reach into the kiln, pull the piece out, and put it into the trash can. All right, she's going to open it up here. All right, you can lower it. I want to put the piece into the paper, get that paper ignited well, and I kind of tip it and turn it as it sits inside of the trash can. And then I want to put the lid on. And a lot of people think that it's a race of how, whoops, there go my tongues. It's a race of how quickly you get the lid on there. And it's really not. What I look for is the paper to ignite really well. And I look in and I can see actually metallics developing on the pieces. And that's when I put the lid on and just pop this outside. All right, thank you. I'm going to pop that outside. We're going to let that cool while I go back into the studio. So I'm just going to turn this camera off, and Kevin's going to go over to the other camera. All right, I should be unmuted on this camera. Everybody hear me okay?
All right. I can hear you.
So I'm going to flip the camera up here and I'll show you some of these finished pieces, and then I'm going to show you guys the process that we went through to get this. So this is done using stencils, and the shiny areas that you see on here is my Jade Gloss Raku glaze. The background that you see is a combination of the bisque. When you put these pieces in and they are in the trash can, all of that smoke generally penetrates the bisque and turns it kind of a grayish black color. I like a nice rich black in the background, so I actually use underglaze, things like Mako's fundamental underglazes, Amico's velvet underglazes, their LUG underglazes. I do the black, just one coat in the background, and that way it ensures me that I'm going to have a really nice, rich black background. So this one was done actually using this tree stencil, and I've got all of these different stencils on my website, LearnFiredArts.com. And so this was using it, putting the stencil on top and putting the glaze through. And on the back side, I did the stencil, I put wax resist over the stencil and then did glaze in the background. And so this isn't quite as clear because a lot of times with the wax resist, you get little speckles of glaze that are on there, and you get little specks, but look at the cool colors and things that you got on there. So I'm going to show you both of these processes of how that is done. This one here is a brand new stencil. I just got this patchwork feather, and I love the detail in this, and I love the color. I'm going to show you how to use silkscreen thickener that you use like with silk screens. For those of you who do silk screening, we're going to thicken the Raku glaze and use the stencils that way. On this side, I've got these sunflowers. This is another new stencil. These are they're called slimline stencils, and I love that. And then on the sides, I actually used they're not birch trees, they are aspen trees. And this, when I saw Jess come out with her rolling pin with the tree design, I was like, I love this stencil, I love that design. And then I saw her underglaze decals, and I'm like, oh my God, when she did that on the mug the other day, I'm like, I love that. So this is using a matte glaze, where these are done with a gloss glaze. So the aspen trees are a matte. The top of this is done with the jade gloss. And you'll see with Raku, you're going to get a lot of different colors. There's never a guarantee of what you're going to get. This one I love too. This was a newer stencil, this big daisy, and it comes in two sizes, a 12-inch and a 6-inch. And I just did this daisy over the side of this vase, and the colors on that are just so cool. And then I did the aspen trees with the matte glaze on the back side of that one as well. Can you tell I like that glaze, or that stencil? This one is, there's a third glaze that I have, and I'll show the glazes a little bit. This one is kind of cool because this is clear glaze. So I went in and I did some kind of blades of grass coming up on this piece with clear glaze. And then I put the RG600, the copper matte glaze, over the top of it. And anywhere that you put a gloss glaze, and it doesn't matter what color the gloss glaze is, anywhere that gloss glaze is under the matte glaze, it makes it a shiny Raku finish. And so you get that combination of matte and gloss. So you can use the stencils and do a gloss glaze, and it can be clear glaze, it can be baby poop gold that you're never going to use for anything else. You can use that with the stencils and use up some of those odds and ends of glazes, put the Raku glaze over the top, and you get really cool combinations of matte and gloss finishes. So let me get all of this stuff out of the way here. And there's one other technique. And so one of the pieces that I think the one that I took out, I've got two pieces in the kiln, and we just took one out where we do a colorful background. So instead of the black in the background, you can do color behind it. So I'm going to show you that technique first. I'm going to flip the camera down here to my work surface. And I'm going to be working with the background color using stroke and coat. Now you're probably like, well, wait, you were just telling us that for the black, you use the fundamental underglazes or things like velvets. If I want a rich black background, I do the underglaze in the background. So underglaze is basically colored clay or slip. So it's going to fire out dull. And that's why you see that combination of the black background that's real dull and then the glossy Raku glaze. So when I want a really rich black background, I use underglaze. If I want a colorful background, I'm going to use something that fires out glossy. If I did a combination of yellow, red, and orange using a clay-based underglaze, when that gets fired, the orange and red and yellow are going to turn a dirty gray black because they're dull and they're going to take in that smoke, and it's going to distort those colors. If you have a glossy background, the smoke won't really penetrate that. Sometimes you'll get a little bit of discoloration here and there, but for the most part, it's going to stay colorful. So this first piece I'm going to do, we're going to have a colorful background. And I've got a rock here. And so the clay bodies that you work with, and I'll talk about that as I put the colors on here, the clay bodies that you work with, I'm working with low fire earthenware pieces. A lot of people confuse Raku and they think that it's a high fire process, and it's not. It's really a low fire. So my pieces I cast. If I hand build them, I will work with a Raku clay body, or if I wheel throw something, I'll work with a Raku clay body. But with my cast pieces, they're done with earthenware slip. And instead of firing them to an 04 that you would normally probably fire earthenware pieces to, I fire them to like an 06, 07. So it's a little bit cooler temperature, but it makes it less likely that these pieces will split. There are additives you can add to slip to turn them into an actual Raku clay body. And it's a blend of silica sand and some chemicals and things that make that clay body so it can withstand the shock of coming out of the kiln as hot as you saw and causing that paper to light on fire. So this piece is just earthenware. It's a cast piece, and I'm going to apply kind of a sunset background, and I'm just working with one brush, and I'm going to apply yellow to the bottom of this. And while that's still wet, I'm going to dip that brush right into the orange, and I'm going to blend that into the yellow. So I get a blend from yellow to orange. And I want to put this color on heavy enough so that I get good coverage. And then I'm going to go right into the red and blend it wet into wet and apply more of that red on top. If I don't get this glaze on heavy enough, because normally stroke and coat takes 3 coats to get solid coverage and to get a nice glossy finish. If I skimp too much on this, it's not going to fire as shiny, and that smoke will be able to kind of penetrate it. So you want to have it heavy enough, but work wet into wet to get that blend of colors. I'm going to set this aside for just a minute, and then we're going to take it. I'm going to show you by thickening the glaze using this sunflower design we're going to do on top of this with the Raku glaze. The next one that I want to show you is another rock. And this one, what I've done is I've prepared this with the black fundamental underglaze, and I fired that on in the greenware stage. And I only need to put 1 coat. Normally, these underglazes are 3 coats, but I'm not worried if I get a little bit of streakiness in this because it's really about getting a blacker, solid background. So I applied 1 coat of the black underglaze, I fired it, and the light color that you see on here is my Jade Gloss Raku glaze. This is the shiny, glossy finish that you saw in all those other pieces. I applied 1 coat of that, and then I wiped this back with a damp sponge. So I just took a sponge and I wiped it back. And so the light gray that you see around the texture of the rock is what's left of the Raku glaze. And when I fire this, you will get glossy finishes kind of down in the crevices on here, and you'll get that nice flat background. And I'm going to do, this one is called Sunlit Forest, and I'm going to do this one on top of this rock. And then I've got one other rock here. If we have time, I'm going to do that patchwork feather on that one as well. But we'll see if we have time to do all of these. And I've got one other design here that I'm going to show you using wax resist for doing the stencil design. So I have my rock here. I'm going to take some of the Jade Gloss Raku glaze. I'm just going to pour it out on a tile. And if you haven't worked with Silkscreen Medium to thicken glaze, this is great with stencils, because a lot of people will take like sponge dabbers and they will dab the glaze on stencils. And a lot of times they press so hard that the glaze bleeds under the stencil, and you don't get real good results with that. So by using the Silkscreen Medium, the AC310, I've got this available on my website as well. We just take a little pinch of that and we sprinkle it over the top of the Raku glaze. And I know that with this much glaze out here, I'm going to need at least a couple pinches. You don't want to add too much of that, so add a little bit, take a palette knife or a popsicle stick, and just kind of start mashing that Silkscreen Medium into the glaze. And sometimes you'll get some little lumps in there, so I'm kind of pulling into a pile, and then I'm kind of pressing down with the palette knife to kind of squish out any lumps and bumps that I get in there. And I want to work that until it's the consistency of peanut butter or toothpaste is a good consistency. If I pull up on this and it flattens out real smooth, it's not thick enough. I should be able to bring this up and kind of like nice thick frosting, get kind of a peak on it. So I know that I need to add a little bit more. I'll add a little bit more, continue that mixing process, and I kind of bring it in from all over on my palette and really mash that together. And I'm getting closer, but still when I lift up on this, I kind of lose the peak. So I'm going to add just a little bit more. If the color is too fluid and it's not thick enough, when you use it with a silk screen or with a stencil, the color will tend to kind of bleed under. So you want it to be a nice, thick consistency. And as I pull up on this now, I kind of keep my peak. And so I've got a nice, good consistency. And this is, you know, about the consistency of peanut butter or toothpaste. It doesn't taste as good, but it's about the right consistency. So now I can take my stencil, position it on my piece, and I usually kind of hold the stencil down with my thumb and my index finger. And flat surfaces are going to work best. When you start going around rounded surfaces with a stencil, sometimes it can be a challenge because parts of the stencil will kind of bounce up. And you'll find that some of them, if you're looking at a round object, take that stencil and lay it around the edges. Sometimes you won't have areas of pop-up. It really depends on the design of the stencil. But I will hold it with my index finger and my thumb, and then I just go over with this in the area between the two, and I just rub this in. And as I work my way around the stencil, I kind of hold it down. And once you have a small area like this filled in with color, it almost acts like glue that the stencil isn't going to slip and slide, but I still hold it down with my fingers so that I'm less likely to have the color going through the stencil and bleeding under the design. And you don't need to rub a ton on here. And this is basically going to give you a nice thick application of the color because the color is thickened. And on this one, like with the tree designs, you'll see I'm kind of going up and down or more downward with this. I kind of, and as the landscape, the shadows kind of come out, I just kind of follow that contour. I don't want to really fight and go back and forth like this, because the more I do that, the more likely it is that I might force the color under going across the texture or the design on here. You don't want the glaze so thick on here that when you peel the stencil away, you have big globs. So I make sure that I kind of pull across this and drag the excess. So I just get a nice application of that glaze. If the glaze gets too heavy, think about when it's fired. If you get a glaze, if you do 4 or 5 coats of glaze on a piece, what can happen? That glaze can run and flow. So you don't want to get it too heavy. Once I've got that done, I can just gently lift up on that stencil. And the camera here, you can see that I've got really good details in there. And now this piece I can set aside, and that one will dry. And then it'll go into the kiln. I'm going to do the same thing now. My stroke and coat is dry on this one. I'm going to take and do the same thing, same glaze, using the sunflower stencil on this one. While I'm doing this, since I've explained about this, I'll talk a little bit about the firing and the temperatures and the combustibles and things that we're going to be, that I've been using. So the kiln, I fire to a lower temperature than a lot of Raku artists do. And you're going to find that everybody that does Raku is going to have variations. And there isn't really a right or a wrong with this. I've taken lots of Raku workshops. Some of the first ones that I took with somebody that their process was that they dunked the pieces in cold water at one point. And the pieces, I just watched all of these pieces in the workshop break. And I was like, man, I don't ever want to teach this, because more than half of the pieces split when they dunked them in cold water. And their theory was, and a lot of Raku artists do this, is if I take them out of the trash can and I see a color, I see the colors that I like, if I dunk them in water, it's going to freeze that process. And it's true, it will. Once it cools, it will stop the changing of the colors. But I was like, oh my gosh, this is awful. And I'm just watching people's faces when their pieces are splitting. And so, you know, I went to another Raku workshop and I learned a different method from somebody else. And I took another one and I learned a different method. And I took all of those different things that I learned in those different workshops and came up with a process that worked for me. So if you take a workshop and somebody says, you know, this is how you do it, that's what works for them. Try it, play around, and come up with your own technique. So the temperatures that I go to are a little bit cooler. I fire the kiln, and I've got a digital electric kiln that I work with the Raku. And that kiln, I fire to 1730. So I program it to go as quickly as it can, up to 1730 degrees, and then it holds for 10 minutes. And so when you fire that rapidly, sometimes the glazes will get some bubbles and things in them. And so by doing a 10-minute hold, it usually kind of allows those glazes to kind of flatten out and smooth. And then I let the kiln drop to 1680 degrees. And the nice thing with a digital kiln is you can program it like that and you will get consistent results. And if I get busy doing something, the kiln will hold at that 1680 because I usually do a several hour hold on it. It'll hold until I remember and get back to the kiln and take the pieces out. And so a lot of artists will go to higher temperatures, and I encourage you to try different temperatures. Again, see what works for you, what works for your glazes. With my glazes, cooler temperatures, I get better results. Some of the matte glazes, like this one that I used on this vase that you get a real nice matte finish, if you take this one hotter, it gets glossier. So I was at a show a number of years ago. I was at Insika, and one of the glaze manufacturers came up and said, you know, my gosh, that's absolutely beautiful. That piece is beautiful. What glaze did you use on there? And I said, it's actually one of your glazes. And the owner of the company was like, I've never seen colors like that on there. And I said, well, I actually go to cooler temperatures than what you do or what you recommend on the label. And so I talked to their chemist and I was like, you know, why did you put those temperatures, or what, you know, how did you come up with those temperatures? And he's like, well, that was pretty much the standard in the industry that I saw other glaze manufacturers. And so that's kind of what we went with. So again, play around with temperatures. What I'm working with here now is I've got Mako's wax resist and I've got a sponge roller. And so this technique, we're going to put wax resist on here. And this is the aspen trees that I'm working with on here. And so this is going to reverse the stencil. Normally, if you use the stencil the way it is, the areas that are cut out is where your Raku glaze is going to go. But by doing this process, we're going to create the reverse of this. I like to use the sponge rollers because you roll the wax resist on. You can also use these rollers to roll the glaze on if you don't want to do the thickening of the glaze with the silkscreen medium. So again, I kind of hold the stencil down. I'm going to start in the middle and I'm just going to roll this roller over the stencil and it will apply wax in all of my openings. And I was saying with the sponge dabbers, when people push down like this with a sponge dabber, they tend to get too much in there. And again, it bleeds under the stencil a lot. So using this roller, I can just go over the top, get my wax on, lift my stencil away, and it's really hard to see that in the camera. But when I let this dry for a minute and I go back over it and apply the glaze on here, it should repel in the areas where the wax resist is. Do you have any questions at this point, Jessica? I haven't stopped talking, so I'll give you a minute.
No, I know. There's so many.
So I've got an echo. I want to see if it's still there. Nope, it sounds like it's gone. Okay. First one, what temp do you bisque fire pieces to before raccooing?
So, oh, sorry, I thought I said that. Maybe I probably didn't. So instead of going to an 04 on my cast pieces, I go to an 06 or an 07. And I don't know the exact temperature of that, but most kilns are capable of firing to cone temperatures. I want to say 06 is around 18 to 1900 degrees, kind of Fahrenheit, in that range. And so it's a little bit cooler. Normally, most of you are probably firing 04. I know some of you are doing 06 on your bisqueware, but I generally like 06, 07 on the Raku pieces. If it's a Raku clay body, though, you can take it to 04. If you're hand building or wheel throwing, you can take that to cone 04.
Okay, and then could you use a stencil spray adhesive to help keep the stencil in place when you're putting it on over the underglaze?
You could, yeah, you could, and those adhesives. I I did that one time in a workshop, and people threw the stencils in a pile, and they were all stuck together, and that adhesive was just everywhere. And I never did it. But if you're doing it for your own personal use, yes, absolutely.
And then could you use red iron oxide for stenciling instead of underglaze? And if so, would you brush it on over the stencil, or would you roll it on?
Red iron oxide. So I haven't worked with red iron oxide. I'm assuming that fires out red, or
it goes brown. It's really
okay.
It goes brown, but I don't know what it'll do in a raku. I've never done it, but if you were doing it on a regular glazed piece and you wanted the iron oxide detail, yeah, it would work.
Yeah, and it again with that, because red iron oxide doesn't fire out glossy. I'm assuming, is it a matte finish then? If it's
it is matte, yeah, because it's just matte.
It would end up, it wouldn't be that brown color. It would be, because the smoke kind of penetrates those dull flat areas, and so you'd get kind of a brownish black color probably in the end.
Okay, and you can use the thickening technique with stencils in non-raku pieces as well, correct?
Absolutely, and I've actually got a piece here that I was gonna show later, but I will show it now. This is a big platter. This is one of my 20-inch bowls, and this was done using kind of the technique like I did with the yellow, orange, and red in the background. On this one, I did orange and yellow and teal and purple and blue, and I just kind of randomly did a wash of color, and not a wash of color, an application of stroke and coat in the background, and then I laid my stencil on and did with black stroke and coat, thickened it over the top to do this design. And this was just this is an earthenware piece, but I could do it on stoneware as well, because stroke and coat and products like that can go up to the higher temps as well.
We have a question. You used a stencil, but when would it be good to use a silk screen versus a stencil?
So that's a really good question. I did experiment with silk screens, doing it with Raccoon, and I had okay luck with it. What I found was, with the silk screen, the glaze just doesn't get heavy enough going through that silk screen. And so the colors that I got with the Raku glaze, it wasn't as good as using a stencil. Because when you're rubbing that through the silk screen, you're getting a very thin application of that color. And it's really hard to put multiple coats with a silk screen.
And when can we see these finished pieces?
So these finished pieces will be going into the kiln today, and I will take them out later today, and you should be able to see them. And at some point I will show them off and let you guys see them.
Awesome. Let me see if there's more questions. I'm bouncing between 3 sites answering comments.
Yeah, and that's fine. So while you're looking for more questions,
you keep going.
I just took the sponge roller and I just rolled over this piece that I did with the wax resist, and you can see where the glaze is repelling where the wax was. And so now I will get with this one, the Raku glaze is showing the trees. It resisted in the, wait a second, that should be just the opposite of, so the color is going in where the tree design is. I was thinking this should be the reverse of that. And so I can apply this using the sponge roller, putting several coats on, or I can take a brush and apply that. The cool thing that you get with wax resist is there's always little speckles of the glaze that kind of sit on top of the wax. And so the heavier I put this glaze on, the more I'm going to get kind of that beading on top of the areas where the wax is. And it kind of looks like snowflakes or just little speckles in the background, and it's really cool. So I'm going to continue this vase later today, doing the other sides on here, and then I'll fire this and I'll show you guys what it looks like when it's done. I'll post some pictures or something of it, or I'll come back for another clay share and we'll reveal the results of these Raku pieces.
Yeah, when do you plan to fire them? You gonna fire them today?
Yeah, I'll fire them this afternoon, or once we're done with this.
They're done and you want to come to the giveaway cocktail hour wrap up, we could show them then tonight.
Okay.
I don't know if I don't want to, but you've had a long week. I don't want to,
Yeah,
especially with you recovering. Think about it.
Yep, I'll get
not,
them
we'll
in the
show it another
kiln, and
day.
if it's going to work out, I'll let you know before that.
Yeah, fantastic. So we had a question: are you using pearlized Raku glazes, or does the stroke and coat just pearlize like that in the smoking process?
So the colors, all of the colors that you guys are seeing on these pieces, this is the Raku glaze. This is the jade gloss. This is the kaleidoscope is the matte. So I've got a gloss glaze and I've got a matte glaze. And then I've got the one that is a matte finish, the RG600, the copper matte. This is the one that works over the top of any gloss glaze, and you get that combination of gloss and matte with one glaze. So this is the shine. Anywhere that you see the shiny glaze, that's the jade gloss. Anywhere that you see the matte glaze, that's the kaleidoscope. And then this vase is the one with the combination of the gloss glaze underneath the copper matte.
And someone
So
wants to know,
the stroke and coat doesn't, the stroke and coat is just going to give us a colorful background.
okay, and someone wants to know, is there a material you can add to stoneware slip to make it a Raku slip?
There is. So there's formulas out there, I know, online. I've used Paula McCoy, who was in and did a workshop, and I think she's doing another one today. She has it comes in like a half-gallon jug, and it's got the chemicals and the silica sand. You just add that to the slip, and it will turn it into a Raku clay body. And that's where, with me, with casting all of my clay puzzling molds, they're all cast with earthenware. And I don't want to have two different batches of slip and cross-contaminate things. And so that's why I choose just to pour my pieces with earthenware slip, fire them a little bit cooler, and rarely do I have any pieces that crack.
So a lot of people are asking about the clay because Michael did mention already that he does fire his Raku a lot cooler. That's why he doesn't have the cracking issues using an earthenware clay. So you don't have to use a Raku clay if you fire cooler. If you're going to fire the traditional Raku temperatures, or if it's hand built or wheel thrown, you probably do want, because you have seams and joints. But slip casting can be a whole different thing.
Right. And I can take my slip cast, my earthenware cast pieces, I can take them up to a higher temperature in the Raku firing, but I just find with these glazes, I get better results. And I've played around with Amico's glazes, Mako's glazes, Spectrum's glazes, and Paula McCoy has some Raku colors, and they come out really nice at those lower temperatures too. And the reason I started doing the lower temperature was I found with this matte glaze that if I fired it hotter, it got glossier, and I wanted that really matte finish. And so I don't want to be programming and doing separate loads that some go to this temperature and some go to that temperature. And I just found that it works well at those lower temperatures. All right. Any other questions that you see there, Jess?
I think we got them all for now.
Okay. So
Got
what
it.
I'm going to do is I'm going to go grab that piece out of the trash can. I'm going to put my camera back up here, and we will get that piece out. I just have to step back here, and I'm going to grab that. And a lot of times at this point, these pieces are still pretty hot. Oops, that's not the right can. I put it outside. I had a second can ready there and I opened it up and I'm like, there's nothing in there. All right, so I'm glad I did pull the right piece out of the kiln. This is the one with the colorful background. This piece is still pretty warm, but this is like I did on that rock with the smaller sunflowers. This is a larger version. And so you can see that the yellow stroke and coat, the orange and the red came out nice and bright and vibrant. And then my stencil design on there is done with the jade gloss. So I get some metallic finishes. And then the back of this is done with the copper matte. And so I've got some really cool colors on there. We'll talk a little bit now about combustibles. Just set this back aside. I like to work with newspaper for my combustible, and you can use a lot of different things. Anything basically that's dry and safe for the environment, you can burn. So things like styrofoam peanuts, not a good option for your combustible. The reason I like to use sheet newspaper in the can is because I can line the sides of the can and I can put it in the bottom. So I put about 5 to 7 layers of newspaper inside the can, and I can use shredded paper, but it's very messy and it works great. But I find in workshops that people are pulling out shredded paper and it's blowing all over outside. And so I like the sheet newspaper. And so when I take that piece out of the kiln, I can just touch it to the paper, kind of tap it on the sides of the can, and then the paper ignites really quickly. Where shredded paper, you touch it and it just ignites really quickly. So that's an advantage to shredded paper. Things like dry leaves, they work well, straw, sawdust. Some of the characteristics, though, of dry leaves is you can get some scarring. It's called scarring on your pieces. And I can always tell when I go to an art show and I'll pick up somebody's Raccoon piece and I'll feel the bottom. And if you feel kind of sharp little indentations on there and kind of a rough feeling, a lot of times I can tell that they either use straw or leaves, because think about leaves. They have, the stems of them usually are pretty stiff and hard and thick. And so if you take a gloss glaze and you pull it out of the kiln when it's 1800 degrees and you put it into those leaves, all of those little stems can kind of get embedded in the glaze, because some of those glazes are pretty soft at that stage when you first put them in there. But then when they hit that cool air, they kind of harden fast. And if that little leaf stem gets embedded in the glaze, and as it's burning away, the glaze is hardening, you can get kind of some little sharp edges and some textures and things on there. So that's a disadvantage to leaves, is you can get textures. Straw sometimes can do that too. If the straw is real thick and stiff, it just takes a little bit longer for it to burn away. Things like dry grass usually work well. Sawdust can give you really cool effects. And the type of wood that the sawdust is made with too can have some interesting effects. So things like pine is going to burn a lot faster than, say, oak. But if I take a piece and I've got the whole piece glazed and I put this down in sawdust, and say I've got 3 inches of sawdust in the bottom of my trash can, generally wherever the glazes get smothered, so if the bottom 2 inches of this goes down into the sawdust, I generally will see a lot more copper in that area, and then my colors all kind of come up from there. So you can play around with sawdust, and instead of putting a vase like this straight into the sawdust, put it in at an angle, and you'll get usually kind of a copper area, solid copper, where it gets smothered, and then your colors come up from there. You can take and throw sawdust on top of it. I generally find, and you never get the same result. You know, when I get people who are, I've got one lady that takes a lot of Raku workshops, and she's always like, I want my pieces to be solid copper. And I'm like, well, good luck with that, because there's no guarantee. Every piece turns out different. I love all the different colors, the blues, the purples, the fuchsias. When I see purples and fuchsias like this, I get really excited to see those, because that really deep purple fuchsia color is more of a challenge to get. When I see solid copper, I don't get quite as excited. I like all of those cool color combinations in there. So there is no guarantee of what colors you're going to get. You should get a combination of coppers. You should get a combination of greens and purples, and it depends on the glazes. Every glaze is different. If it's a copper glaze, and so all of these glazes that I have are copper bearing glazes. There's copper in the glaze. And if you see that you get a lot of green, usually that's a sign that the piece got a little bit too cool. So a lot of times on tops of pieces, I will see a lot of green toward the top. And I watch as people take the pieces out and they work them in the trash can. And I always tell them, don't hold it up above the trash can in the flames, hold it down in the can and work it in the can and tip it and turn it in those flames as you set it down. If you hold it up above the can, and while the flames are still hitting it, a lot of times if I see the top of the piece is real green, it's usually, I tell them, I'll be like, you're going to get green on the top of your piece because the cool air hit that, and that glaze did more of a traditional firing, and you didn't hold it down in the can in the flame. So as cool air hits that glaze is going to mature. And these glazes, if I fired them out to an 06, they would be a green glaze. So play around too with some of your colors. If you're mixing your own glazes, there's lots of formulas out there for Raku finishes. But usually some of the blue greens that in the hobby market they use for Christmas trees, a lot of times those are good Raku glazes because there's usually a lot of copper to get that blue green color. I had a lady, a workshop, she did red onion peels. Her daughter worked at Subway, and she said she had her daughter bring home the red onion peels and she let them dry out, and she would put those in with her newspaper. And she said, I get beautiful burgundies. And so she came one time for one of my retreats, and she did some of the Raku, and we did Raku as a group. And we threw those red onion peels in, and sure enough, we had the most beautiful burgundies and things on the pieces. I've talked to artists who use oil-soaked paper towels. There's a lot of really strange stuff out there. There's some dangerous stuff that I've heard. So just keep in mind, whatever you use for a combustible, it should be safe for the environment. I've had people use like rubbing alcohol. They pour rubbing alcohol on the pieces and do things with it. I'm looking at my other camera, and I set that trash can in the kiln room, and I'm looking at all the smoke in that
can
room.
See it.
Yeah, if I open this door, you guys can see how smoky it is in there.
Nice.
So the can is actually flaming up, and that's something that you want to put the lid on the can. That's something I always do in the workshops. Put the lid on the can because it can ignite up after you walk away. A little breeze gets to it, and those ashes that are in there will start up back on fire. So
we got a minute left.
All right.
Another question: do the colors change over time with Raku?
With Raku, colors can change over time. I always suggest don't place them in direct sunlight for extended periods of time. So don't put them in your front window so all your neighbors can see your beautiful Raku. Don't put them outside. But we were talking last night, Jessica had experimented with using two-part resin, epoxy type resins, and you can put that on there, and that actually should protect those finishes on there.
Yeah, it seals them up. So, and it makes them watertight. So.
Yep.
It's so all right. Well, I'm sad that's it, Michael, for ClayShareCon for you.
Yes.
But thank you so much for spending the 5 days with us. We've loved every minute of it.
I enjoyed it, and I appreciate everybody that's supporting all of the vendors. I mean, I've gone in yesterday, I bought a strong arm, I bought some stamps from, all different stuff. So appreciate it. We've got lots of orders to fill. I know Clayscapes, everybody else has had an incredible week. You guys broke Paula's website last night, but she got it working.
Well, again, she's on next, so they might break it again. We'll see.
Yep, absolutely.
So I know. Well, thank you. It has been a treat.
Thanks so much, Michael. Now, I have to do some shopping, but that won't happen till this evening. I've got a list, so I'll get it done. So that was wonderful. If you just came in and you missed the beginning and you have more questions and maybe you're like, well, what does it look like when it's done? Go watch the replay, because Michael did it where he showed you the finished pieces at the beginning and then walked you through the process so you could see the whole thing full circle. And we will make sure we get to see the pieces he worked on with us at some point in ClayShare. We'll put them up somehow. We'll get them to you. All right, so we're going to take a little break. We're going to be back at 11 a.m. for a wonderful tutorial on shading and antiquing with Paula McCoy from Colors